Good morning. Good morning and welcome to the 12th Annual Executive Branch Review Conference. My name is Nate Kazmarek, and I am Vice President and Director of the Practice Groups for the Federalist Society. On behalf of my colleagues and the practice group leadership, we are thrilled to once more be gathered at the Mayflower to discuss the current state of the executive branch and the administrative state. I also want to welcome our audience joining us via the live stream. We appreciate your viewership and look forward to your feedback. One quick logistical item: if you are seeking CLE for your attendance today, please be sure to check in and check out using the QR code on the back of your program. This year's conference theme is the Constitution and regulatory overreach. If you ask some on Capitol Hill about our topic, they will tell you that we live in a target-rich environment and that the current administration is, quote, burying Americans in red tape. Supporters of the administration, however, praise the efforts to expand regulatory protections and enforcement and modernize the regulatory review process. But that is all the table setting I will be doing this morning. Our practice group executive committees have been hard at work to put together a full day of debate and discussion on these matters, so much so that every moment from now until 6 o'clock tonight is spoken for. So I will quickly turn to the task of introducing our excellent first speaker for this morning's opening address, the Honorable Paul Ray. I've known Paul for years, and together we've discovered a shared interest in good books. Often when we get together, one of us will bring to the other a new book we have recently finished for the other to enjoy. We've agreed that we both like much of the exceptional writing of the novelist Mark Halperin. And in thinking about introducing Paul today, I was reminded of a famous quote that a New York Times critic once wrote when reviewing one of Mark Halperin's books. That critic stated on the front page of the New York Times, "I find myself nervous to a degree I don't recall in my past as a reviewer about failing the work and inadequately displaying its brilliance." I feel much the same about introducing Paul. Paul is the director of the Thomas A. Rowe Institute for Economic Policy Studies at the Heritage Foundation. He previously served in government as the administrator of the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs or OIRA. Before that, he served as counselor to the U.S. Secretary of Labor. He clerked for Judge Deborah Ann Livingston of the United States Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit and for Justice Alito on the Supreme Court. His law degree is from Harvard, and his undergrad was at Hillsdale. Go Chargers. He is a deep thinker, a constitutional scholar, but unusual in this town is that his considerable intelligence is only outpaced by his genuine warmth and kindness. He is a great friend, and I think I can say without hesitation that for all his accolades and titles, his favorite roles are more recent, those of husband and father. Please join me in welcoming Paul Ray. Let me get out of the way.
Nate, thank you very much. It's a beautifully generous introduction. It's a real pleasure to be here. Even if it weren't such a pleasure to be here, it would be totally worth it just to share a platform with you. So thank you so much. It was very generous of you. It's a great honor to be here to offer a few thoughts on today's topic, which, as Nate said, is the Constitution and regulatory overreach. I've titled this short talk, "Beyond the Parchment Barriers." This famous phrase, as many of you know, comes from Federalist 48, and I want to quote the passage that is its home in full. "Will it be sufficient to mark with precision the boundaries of these departments and the constitution of the government, and to trust to these parchment barriers against the encroaching spirit of power? This is the security which appears to have been principally relied on by the compilers of most of the American constitutions, but experience assures us that the efficacy of the provision has been overrated, and that some more adequate defense is indispensably necessary," end quote. I've begun with this passage because in this Supreme Court term, especially, we are concerned with marking the boundaries of power with precision, though it is the boundaries of the agencies, rather than of the three branches named in the Constitution, that we are concerned with marking. SEC versus Jarkissi considers the necessity for articulating boundaries to agency authority, and of course Loper-Bright Enterprises versus Raimondo presents the question of how to resolve ambiguity at the boundaries. Both cases have aroused great interest in the administrative law community, and rightly so. For one of the gravest problems with today's administrative system is that agency authorities are open-ended and vague. Sound decisions in Jarkissi and Loper-Bright would result in clearer limits around agency authorities, and that would be a tremendously positive step in the right direction. But at the same time, we mustn't overlook Madison's point in Federalist 48. There's a danger that, in this term of all terms, we'll focus too closely on marking with precision the boundaries of agency authority and forget about the structural protections that can make those boundaries more adequate, to quote Madison. We learn about these protections beginning in Federalist 51. They have to do with both motives and means. The framers sought to give officials in each branch of government the motives to act in the way they're supposed to act, and the means to check each other. We might say the first defense was meant to prevent officials from pressing too hard against the parchment barriers. The second, to ensure that officials effectively man the barriers against each other. This morning, I'd like to sketch a few ways the administrative state fails to provide the motives and means the founders believed vital to make parchment barriers effective. These failures mean that even if Congress could be made to draw relatively precise boundaries around agency powers, and even if the courts could be made to give effect to them, we'd still have good reason to worry about the administrative state. First, let's reflect on the ways the founders gave lawmakers the right motives to play their constitutional role. Pride of place, of course, must go to elections, which motivate congressmen to vindicate the views and interests of their constituents. Madison famously observed that the sweeping extent and diversity of the young republic would bring a vast array of opinions and interests into the legislature. This diverse representation means that particular factions cannot easily ram through legislation to their exclusive advantage. It also means that legislative proposals are subject to criticism from the perspective of every interest and opinion. The result is legislation that takes many concerns into consideration and makes intelligent trade-offs among them. As the Supreme Court has explained, no legislation pursues its purposes at all costs. It's not enough to conclude that a bill would advance some objective or another. For enactment, it must do so at no greater cost to other objectives than legislators interested in those objectives are willing to pay. Indeed, as the Court has put it, deciding what competing values will or will not be sacrificed to the achievement of a particular objective is the very essence of legislative choice. The founders, of course, did not rely just on elections to give lawmakers the right motives. They also sought to create a, quote, communion of interests and sympathy of sentiments between Congress and the people, as Federalist 57 puts it. They did so by drawing representatives from the people and returning them to private life at short intervals, at least in the House. Madison explained further in Federalist 57 that members of Congress, quote, can make no law which will not have its full operation on themselves and their friends, as well as on the great mass of the society, end quote, a connection which he says has always been deemed one of the strongest bonds by which human policy can connect the rulers and the people together. If the people, and again Madison's words, shall ever be so far debased as to tolerate a law not obligatory on the legislature as well as on the people will be prepared to tolerate anything but liberty. One of the main guarantors of the communion of interests and sympathy of sentiments between Congress and the people is the separation of powers. For as Montesquieu explains, where the powers are united, the same body of magistrates will be possessed as executors of the laws of the whole power they have given themselves in the quality of legislators. The ability to enhance their own power through legislation would mean that members of Congress would experience legislation in a very different way from the people. For a statute that severely diminishes an average citizen's ability to carry out his plans might dramatically enhance a member of Congress's ability to carry out his legislative agenda. And this difference in perspective would disrupt the union of interests and sentiments the founders wished to create. Now let's think for a minute about the motives that the administrative state's architecture is likely to give regulators. The first thing we notice, of course, is that regulators are unelected. They lack what both the Federalist and common sense tell us is the main vehicle for aligning the government's motives with those of the governed. Further, unlike Congress, agencies are specialized. Often their specialization appears in their names. It's no mystery what the Environmental Protection Agency protects or the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission regulates. We need only read James Landis's The Administrative Process to realize how large a role specialization played in the New Dealers' hopes that agencies would be both effective and insulated from politics. Specialization is driven not just by statutory mandate, but by agency staffing practices. Agency staff, especially high-ranking staff, usually join agencies whose mission they believe is important. Agencies are thus filled with employees whose own interests push them toward the very specialization that their statutes demand. Now, agencies specialize by focusing on some concerns to the exclusion of others. EPA, for instance, specializes in fighting pollution precisely by not worrying too much about national defense, the stock market, etc. We should therefore not be surprised when we find that agencies often develop tunnel vision. Michigan versus EPA from several years ago offers us an illuminating, if extreme, example. The agency there took the position that regulation to control mercury emissions from power plants would be necessary and appropriate, even if the harmful collateral consequences vastly outweighed the good that controlling these emissions would achieve. Agencies regularly succumb to similar, if less striking, myopia. They are motivated to pursue their own special missions with little thought for other priorities. In this way, agencies' motives differ from Congress's, whose members' diverse interests push it toward an all-things-considered approach. Nor are agencies likely to experience the communion of interests and sympathy of sentiments for which the founders hoped from Congress. Members of Congress tend to reflect the values of the people who elect them. Not so for agency staff, who self-select into their agencies. Nor do agency staff return to the people as the founders expected members of Congress would. It's quite common for agency staff to spend their entire careers in federal service. But most tellingly, agencies don't live under the regulations they issue in the same way that people do. Of course, agency staff are not formally exempt from their own regulations. Someone who works at DOL and also happens to run a business must follow DOL's wage and hour regulations, for instance. The point is that agency staff are not likely to engage in the activities they regulate just because their line of work is regulating, rather than working in a regulated field. Nor are the staff who set policy, overwhelmingly resident here in Washington, likely to be a part of the communities that experience their regulations' main effects. But agency staff do not just experience regulations differently than the people. The union of legislative and executive power allows agencies to expand their own executive power by using their legislative power. And this means agencies' interests in a given regulation may be opposite to the people's. For what an agency experiences as enhancing its power may diminish the people's, and vice versa. Regulatory clarity and stability, for instance, help regulated parties to plan, but restrict agencies' ability to respond to changing needs. All this can give agencies a very different perspective on regulations than the people have. Now let me be clear. My point is not at all that agency staff have bad motives. To the contrary, during my time in government, I formed the highest regard for the public spirit of very many agency employees, both political appointees and career civil servants. I saw men and women of both descriptions seek what they believed was best for the country simply because they believed it best. But public spiritedness isn't the same as the communion of interests and sympathy of sentiments that the founders aimed to create. The former, taken by itself, is compatible with a high degree of deviation from the people's views. Indeed, dedication to the public good can itself be the motive for seeking regulatory power that the regulated public would prefer to withhold. I'd like to turn now to the second of the protections I mentioned earlier, the means by which the founders enabled officials to man the parchment barriers against each other. Let me begin with Federalist 63, which famously explains that the true distinction between the ancient republics and the American regime lies at the total exclusion of the people in their collective capacity from any share in the latter. Again, Madison's words. The need for this exclusion is clear. Because in a popular regime, the people are sovereign and hence irresistible, constitutional commitments can succeed only insofar as they're the commands of the people and not limits upon them. And the only way to keep a constitution from degenerating into the latter is for the people to exclude themselves from active governance. To carry out this exclusionary approach, the people committed in the Constitution to govern only through representatives. But they went further. They also gave each of the three branches of government a democratic mandate, so that no official or group of officials may claim to stand in perfectly for the people and thus reintroduce them into governance. Because each official has some claim to speak for the people, but none has a total claim, officials can check each other, each invoking the people's own authority to counter the others, and in this way making good on the Constitution's limits. One goal of the architects of the administrative state was to overcome the Constitution's system of checks, which they felt thwarted necessary federal action. In his book, Constitutional Government, Woodrow Wilson explained that the president, because he can embody and direct the aspirations of the nation, can assemble a weight of public opinion that makes him irresistible in conflicts with other political actors. Wilson thought the president would be able to appeal to the people over the heads of congressional factions and thus bring unity of purpose to federal action. Of course, Congress has its own democratic mandate on which it can draw when resisting presidential pretensions, but the courts are far less able to invoke the popular will. That's one reason for their natural feebleness, to quote Federalist 78. And while conflict between a popular president and the courts has erupted from time to time throughout our nation's history, the prospect of such conflict should always give us pause, since at its worst, it pits the Constitution against the self-proclaimed tribune of the people. Now, the courts have been reviewing agency actions for decades. Pretty often, such review goes unremarked by the public. If you want proof, just try talking to your airplane seatmate about recent developments in APA case law. I've tried it. What's new in recent years is the rise of presidential administration, and this has fundamentally changed judicial review of rulemakings in at least two ways. First and most obviously, presidential administration means that courts reviewing administrative action sometimes find themselves facing not just an agency with a modest public profile, but the president and his millions of supporters. Second, as the public has become accustomed to aggressive presidential use of agency rulemaking authorities, presidents have encountered growing demands for regulatory action to solve all the day's most pressing problems. The difficulty is that presidents do not, in fact, have the powers to play, in William Howard Taft's words, the part of a universal providence and set all things right. So, rather as Congress passes the buck by enacting statutes that foist the ultimate policy decision onto administrative agencies, presidents seek to pass the buck by appearing to act on problems they cannot solve. They can pass the buck to the courts by directing regulations that respond to popular demands very visibly, but that are very unlikely to survive judicial review. Their incentives to do this can only increase upon realizing that campaigning against the courts can be electorally rewarding. While I don't wish to be too controversial, the student loan forgiveness episode appears to be a case in point. The legal basis for that action was very weak, and so the ultimate outcome of the litigation was entirely predictable. The result was that the president received credit from his supporters for addressing an important problem. That his solution didn't ultimately work was, of course, the court's fault, not his. Within hours of the court's decision, he sought to turn it to his electoral advantage in televised remarks in which he identified himself with, in his words, millions of Americans who felt angry about the court's decision. Now, bucks cannot be passed forever. Even those that don't stop in the Oval Office have to stop somewhere. I fear that more and more often on important national issues, the buck will stop with the courts, who are far less suited than Congress to bear the brunt of frequent conflicts with the executive. Sound decisions in Jarkissi and Loper-Bright cannot avoid that danger. Indeed, clear lines around agency authorities may bring the courts into more frequent conflict with the White House. Now, that's not a good reason for the court to avoid its duty in these two cases. It is, though, a good reason for all of us not to expect the court to fix all that's wrong with the administrative state. The court is not a universal providence any more than the president is. While we should be pursuing administrative law reform in the courts with vigor, we should also seek more properly political solutions that bring Congress back onto the field, for instance, and that make the most of the willingness of states to push back on federal overreach. Reinvigorating these and other checks would revive the healthy tensions on which the founders relied to make the Constitution's parchment barriers effective. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. I didn't oversell you. Appreciate your brilliant remarks. You gave us a lot to chew on. As I mentioned, we have a tight schedule, so we want to move quickly to our excellent first panel of the day, and I would ask each of those speakers for the first panel to please join me up here. This plenary session is titled, Is the Whole of Government Greater Than the Sum of Its Parts? And it was put together by the great chair of our Administrative Law Executive Committee, Lee O'Connor, and several other members of the committee. Our thanks to all of them. As you've come to expect from our conferences, we have an embarrassment of legal expertise with us here today, and we are pleased that the moderator for this session is the Honorable Jonathan Skrmetti, the Attorney General of Tennessee. His abbreviated bio is as follows. General Skrmetti was appointed by the Tennessee Supreme Court to serve an 8-year term, and he was sworn into office in September of 2022. Prior to his current role, General Skrmetti served in several capacities in the Tennessee government, in private practice, and as a federal prosecutor, first at the Civil Rights Division, and then as an assistant U.S. attorney in Memphis. General Skrmetti's degrees are from George Washington University, the University of Oxford, and Harvard Law School. He clerked for Stephen Colleton on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 8th Circuit. Full bios for A.G. Skrmetti and for all of our speakers today are available to you on our website, fedsoc.org. With that, please welcome a good friend of the Society, General Skrmetti, and our distinguished panel.
Thank you, Dave. Good morning, everybody. It is my privilege to be able to introduce this panel. I'm going to move fast because we have a lot to talk about and they have a lot to say. I'll start to my immediate left with Braden Busek, who is the Vice President for Litigation at the Southeastern Legal Foundation. He previously served as the Vice President of Legal Affairs at the Beacon Center of Tennessee, and in both roles he was involved in active litigation to promote liberty and check the government. He's been a litigator since 2001. He was a decorated federal prosecutor in both Nashville and Memphis for almost a decade. He also served as a state prosecutor, and he worked in the Tennessee Attorney General's office. If any of you know young lawyers looking for jobs, we're always hiring. Braden obtained his law degree from Florida State University and his bachelor's from the University of Richmond. Proceeding further down the line, we have the Honorable Gail Harriet. Professor Harriet serves as a professor of law at San Diego School of Law. Since 2007, she's also been a member of the United States Commission on Civil Rights. I think anybody who comes to one of these conferences appreciates her enduring commitment to protecting civil rights and promoting the Constitution and its appropriate application by the federal government. She also serves on the board of directors of the National Association of Scholars and the California Association of Scholars. She previously served as the Civil Rights Counsel to the Senate Committee on the Judiciary and worked in private practice. David Mitchell serves as a senior fellow at the Washington Center for Equitable Growth, focusing on tax and regulatory policy. He previously served as Director of Government and External Relations there, and prior to joining Equitable Growth, he was the Associate Director for Policy and Market Solutions at the Aspen Institute Financial Security Program, where he led a team responsible for amplifying research and spurring action to address short and long-term financial challenges facing low and moderate income Americans. He previously worked as a legislative aide to Senator Sherrod Brown, handling healthcare and Social Security issues, and held positions with the Senate Finance Committee, the White House National Economic Council, in private practice with Hogan Lovells, and at OMB, as well as Citizens for Tax Justice and the National Association of Community Health Centers. He holds a BA from Tufts, an MPA from Princeton, and his law degree from Georgetown University Law Center. Finally, we have Anthony Campo, who is principal at Clark Hill Public Strategies and an attorney at Clark Hill PLC. He previously served as Chief of Staff and Counselor at the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs within OMB, overseeing the development of most new federal regulations and guidance. He clerked for Judge Naomi Rao on the DC Circuit, has served as in-house counsel and assistant secretary of the board of a large university, and served as a regulatory fellow at a major think tank in Washington, D.C. So thank you to each of you for serving on this panel. We are here to discuss the whole of government approach to regulation. And the whole of government approach is, as it sounds, focused on using the entire apparatus of the federal executive, or in other countries, all of the ministries, to pursue solutions to the same policy area. So you're looking from every angle of federal regulatory authority at solving certain problems. In the current administration, we see a whole of government approach to unions, to climate change, to sexual orientation and gender identity issues. There are a variety of these whole of government policy priorities. And as you heard Paul discuss, this is a relatively novel approach to the use of the administrative state in the United States. So I'm going to give each speaker approximately 8 minutes to talk through your initial reaction to whole of government and highlight salient points. Then we're going to have an exchange between the speakers, and then we'll have some time to open it up to questions. With that, Gail, would you like to kick us off with the...
I thought Braden was going to go first.
Oh, Braden? Go ahead.
That's fine. I think I'd rather lead for Professor Harriet than the other way around. I'll talk about one whole of government approach in particular that I find alarming. That's the whole of government approach to equity that's currently the priority for this administration. And the position I'll take is that the whole of government approach contravenes the central promise of the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal, as well as threatening to undermine important separation of powers principles. Now, the whole of government equity approach is attributable to a day one priority of this administration. On day one, this administration declared by executive order that the American dream was, quote, out of reach for too many Americans, and that it would pursue an ambitious whole of government equity agenda. And in subsequent executive orders, the administration makes equally clear about what steps it would take and what goal it intended. It said that it would, quote, continuously embed equity into all aspects of federal decision-making, and it would require agencies to implement a, quote, comprehensive equity strategy that would yield, and here I underline the phrase, equitable outcomes. And the EOs were then equally clear about precisely what it meant when it was trying to generate equal outcomes. It specifically defined the racial categories and other supposedly persecuted minority groups that it thought the federal government should ensure equitable outcomes for. Now, it might not be totally evident what they meant by the phrase equity. Now, maybe this high-sounding and vague euphemism is nothing but an aspiration. And maybe it doesn't mean that they'll sacrifice equality in the name of achieving so-called equitable outcomes. But when you go a little bit further and see how agencies are implementing this strategy, you will find that overt discrimination is precisely what this administration means when it pursues an overt, whole of government approach to equity. Let me give you just one example from an agency I know well because I sue it with regularity, the United States Department of Agriculture. The United States Department of Agriculture, pursuant to the equity agenda, has instituted what it calls an equity action plan. A lot of the agencies have these equity action plans. And it proclaims in the equity action plan that equity is, quote, more than a catchphrase, it is a promise. And it's stated that it strives to institutionalize this emphasis on equity. Now, many of you are aware of the effort in 2021 of the United States Department of Agriculture to forgive the loans of every farmer in America who it deemed to belong to a category it called, quote, socially disadvantaged. What many of you may know is that the United States Department of Agriculture itself defined socially disadvantaged farmer to mean express racial categories. And so in other words, the United States Department of Agriculture, entirely based on skin color, was proposing to waive away the loans of every farmer in America who belonged to a certain racial category. Many of you also recall that through an avalanche of preliminary injunctions that were correctly entered, this program was immediately halted hardly before it ever came into effect. Now, rather than continue to allow USDA to defend the indefensible, Congress wisely decided to repeal the program. All of these cases were subsequently deemed moot by any court to consider the question. Now, you would think that if the United States Department of Agriculture is going to be arguing that these definitions are now moot and not capable of repetition, then that would mean it had abandoned the definition of socially disadvantaged altogether. Not so. In fact, the United States Department of Agriculture continues to employ this racially problematic term, smearing it all throughout its regulatory code, in many instances in regulations that it has promulgated since the 2021 loan forgiveness program was halted. USDA continues to maintain these categories of socially disadvantaged, and it does so through a form that it self-administers on the local level that categorizes whether or not farmer belongs to the socially disadvantaged category. And these racial categories are the same categories that, as David Bernstein has thoroughly demonstrated, are as incoherent as they are contrived. Why are Pakistanis socially disadvantaged but not Afghans? Nobody knows. And right now, the United States Department of Agriculture is continuing to give more disaster relief to farmers to the races that it has deemed to be socially disadvantaged than other farmers for the same amount of loss. Now, as we keep saying in our lawsuit challenging this program at Southeastern Legal, natural disasters don't discriminate. So why is the United States Department of Agriculture? Even worse, unlike the Farm Loan Forgiveness Program, this lacks any kind of congressional authorization altogether. This is entirely something that the United States Department of Agriculture has come up through funding formulas that it is administering internally. So this is things like notices of funding availabilities or proposed rulemakings, all of which do not need to go through the regular legislative process. Now, nothing could better illustrate the dangers of a whole-of-government approach. It started with one word, equity, but it ultimately ends with just another box on a bureaucratic form. In this way, equality has been devoured by the whole of government's enthusiastic appetite for equitable outcomes. And while the promise of the Declaration of Independence that all men in America are to be treated equally by their own government has always been subjected to stress testing throughout our nation's history, nevertheless, this still marks something new. Never before has the federal government so enthusiastically thrown American values overboard and devoted the full might of the American government to a contrary policy without congressional backing. Now, typically, when equality has been tested throughout our nation's history, it's the federal government who's been the good guy. But now, aided by an overeager and unaccountable bureaucratic class, racial classifications are proliferating, and even worse, it's all too easy to overlook unless you are well acquainted with the minutiae of the Code of Federal Registrations, a fate I wish upon no one in this room. Now, the role of the courts, as Paul alluded to, is certainly to enforce the Constitution's guarantees, all of them, and that means equality, but the principles of separation of powers cannot be overlooked as well. Perhaps no issue should be considered to be politically significant than the use of a so-called benign racial classification in a government program. It is, after all, discrimination against an American citizen. And so, in addition to ruling that such classifications are unconstitutional, courts should find that the use of a racial classification is a major question that requires clear congressional authorization that is lacking in something like a routine outlay for funds for disaster relief. We shouldn't lose confidence, however. Equality is a remarkably durable idea. It has survived everything from kings, slavocrats, eugenicists, Nazis, communists, and segregationists. It is certainly up to the challenge posed by bureaucrats and celebrities hungry for likes. But it will fail if we fail to lose confidence in it. And we should not let our own government undermine it for any reason, certainly not a mere desire for efficiency in governmental operations. Thank you.
Thank you, Braden. I will note this might be the one room in the United States where people would appreciate a chance to dive into the CFR for a while. Professor Harriet, would you like to follow?
Okay, it's going to be hard to say something worthwhile in 8 minutes, but let me give it a try here. I've been asked to comment on the Biden administration's so-called whole government approach to equity, which isn't really a whole government approach at all, since it doesn't include the judicial and legislative branches. It's a whole executive branch approach. Mind you, I don't think it's a terrible thing in itself for a president to want the whole executive branch to act on his priorities. That sure beats a situation where a duly elected president is being undermined by unelected career civil servants. But here, as Braden has described, the heart of the problem may be that the president's concept of equity is deeply flawed. This flawed concept of equity isn't new. Some advocates have long been pushing the notion that any racial, ethnic, or sex disparity is inherently a bad thing and must be remedied with preferential treatment or with abolishing standards. Some advocates have even been pushing the notion that all of our history is about racial, ethnic, and sexual oppression, and that it is the government's duty to fix it right away. What's new, I think, is that this view has come close to a level of obsession by the government itself. The executive branch, in a word, has gone woke. Now, in some cases, it seems that the whole government approach is aimed at circumventing the other branches. I think some of the effort in the transgender area fits this category. I think some of the things that Braden has been talking about fit that category. But to me, what is most troubling is that in other cases, the courts and Congress, especially the courts and Congress of decades past, have been enablers in this flawed approach to equity. Think, for example, Griggs versus Duke Power Company, which defined liability for discrimination under Title VII to include liability for mere disparate impact, because virtually everything has disparate impact on some race, sex, national origin, or religious group. Griggs made virtually everything an employer could do presumptively illegal, and thereby gave the executive branch enormous discretion to go after employers for whatever they wanted. Congress acquiesced in Griggs when it passed the Civil Rights Act of 1991, and then the Supreme Court expanded the concept to include fair housing in Texas Department of Housing and Community Affairs versus the Inclusive Communities Project. I could give you other examples of cooperation from the other branches, but let me go on. It seems to me that the executive branch isn't paying a lot of attention to the Constitution when it implements and expands the programs. The number of federal grant programs that discriminate on the basis of race and that stand very little chance of surviving strict scrutiny, especially in view of the Students for Fair Admissions case, the number seems to be growing. We've got the USDA case mentioned already. Let me mention a couple of more. The National Institutes of Health and the National Science Foundation take race into account in their funding decisions in many different ways now. But all of these programs have not yet been challenged, in part because there aren't that many people or entities with standing that are willing to sue. When something does get challenged, other programs that also discriminate on account of race seem to pop up in their place. One way you can tell how serious the Biden administration is about its equity program is Executive Order number 13985, which is titled in full, Advancing Racial Equity and Support for Underserved Communities Through the Federal Government. So important it was to the Biden administration that it was ready to go on Inauguration Day, and the president signed it then. Among other things, it revoked the Trump administration's executive order that prohibited training programs for federal employees and employees of federal contractors that teach, and I'm going to have to read here from what the Trump executive order said. They wanted to prohibit training to the effect, one, that an individual by virtue of his or her sex is inherently racist or sexist, whether consciously or unconsciously. Or two, that an individual's moral character is necessarily determined by his or her race or sex. Or three, that an individual bears responsibility for actions committed in the past by other members of the same race or sex. Or four, traits such as hard work ethic are racist or sexist or were created to oppress a particular race. Now, those are the things the Trump administration didn't want taught to federal employees. And golly, I think most people would agree with the Trump administration on that. I mean, I don't think that's that controversial. But that's what was repealed on day one of the Biden administration. You know, I could understand repealing it if the Biden administration had replaced it with something, with a policy that they thought would work better for that purpose, but that's not what happened. They just revoked it. And the thinking was that this kind of training was fine and dandy. Executive Order 13985 further states, and again, I'm going to have to more or less quote here, "It is the policy of my administration that the federal government should pursue a comprehensive approach to advancing equity for all, including people of color and others who have been historically adversely affected by persistent inequality. Affirmatively advancing equity, racial justice, and equal opportunity is the responsibility of the whole of our government," there's that term, "because advancing equity requires a systematic approach to embedding fairness in decision-making processes, executive agencies must recognize and work to redress these inequities." Now, if I had just arrived from the planet Neptune, armed only with a dictionary of American English, I'm pretty sure all that would have sounded good to me. Yeah. I wouldn't have known that in progressive circles, equity has come to mean equal outcomes for groups based on race, sex, national origin, achieved by preferential treatment or by abolishing standards altogether. Nor would I have grasped that the term embed, which gets used over and over again these days, was important here. But I think in the context of Executive Order 13985 and later executive orders that made that order's institutional framework and reporting requirements permanent, it means that every single executive department or agency, large or small, must have rules, practices, and most importantly, institutions, committees, that are in their good, embedded, the way like a nail gets embedded in your tire. And they must have equity teams led by a senior official that must produce annual equity action plans that are to generate more and more ways to advance this agenda. Budget requests must then be made to fund these plans. The senior official must be held accountable for implementing the plans. I fear that all of this is going to be difficult to fix. The federal bureaucracy is unlikely to just snap out of this ideology. All the public interest lawsuits and Supreme Court decisions in the world are not going to be enough to solve it if it's embedded in the bureaucracy. Instead, it's going to require a lot of really meticulous work from within the executive branch. Bear in mind that not everything that's produced in these equity plans is going to be bad. Some of it will be fine, but a lot of it is going to be focused on these notions of equalizing outcomes, even if that requires preferential treatment based on race, ethnicity, or sex, or what is sometimes even worse, abolishing standards. Republican administrations tend not to be good at dealing with issues of race, ethnicity, and sex. For one thing, they tend not to have the number of people with expertise in that area of the law that they need. And in part because they don't have the number of people with that level of expertise, they tend to be very timid when it comes to ensuring true equal protection of the laws. When some low-level functionary within the department of such and such tells them, well, we're required to do this by law, the Republican appointees back off because they don't have that much expertise themselves. There just aren't enough of them for that. A lot of what needs to be done is going to be very unglamorous work. Someone needs to examine the equity action plans and the budget requests being made for them. And for that matter, the whole budget needs to be searched line by line, figuring out when the money is going to programs that consider race and sex and why. Whether that, in the context of the particular program, constitutes discrimination, What incentives are being created by those programs, and are those incentives something that can be upheld within the law or not? An example, someone needs to know the law, someone who actually knows the law, needs to understand exactly how the National Institutes for Health and the National Science Foundation consider race, national origin, and sex in deciding who gets funded and who doesn't. They need to figure out if it is the problem that some people think it is, and if so, how to stop it. This is going to require both legal expertise and expertise about the culture of the particular agencies that we're talking about. Most of all, it's going to require political will, which is something that is in short supply. And I'm going to stop there because I suspect I've gone over my 8 minutes, sorry.
Thank you, Professor. And next up, David, do you want to address the mechanism for embedding some of these policy priorities?
Yeah, sure. No, appreciate that, and thanks very much for having me. This should be fun. I come at these questions from a little bit of a different perspective. Equity is embedded in my organization's name, so I think you can kind of tell that we sit at a little bit of a different place. The Washington Center for Equitable Growth, which is an economics think tank, not a legal entity. And we are a nonprofit research and grant-making organization dedicated to advancing evidence-backed ideas and policies that promote strong, stable, and broad-based economic growth. And as the Attorney General mentioned, I think I'll probably narrowly focus a little bit on how equity is playing a role in what's known as the Circular A4, which is a cost-benefit analysis guidelines that are given to agencies about how to do some of the work. But I'll also comment just briefly on, at least from the economics point of view, why equity does matter, why it is important, in my view, and why we're all better off for prioritizing it among the many other policy preferences that we all have and that the president and his administration seems to me justified in pursuing. I should say I'm not speaking for this or any administration, but I do feel like a defense of that agenda is probably called for, just to make for maybe some interesting conversation here. So on the first point of equity being a useful, I think, goal for policymakers to consider is the idea that kind of economic growth and there's long been a thought within economics that there's this inherent trade-off between efficiency and equity. And I think we've run an experiment over the last 2 or 3 decades around this where we have prioritized whether it's in the fiscal policy space, kind of a trickle-down approach of like, let's get the incentives right, let's make sure that high-income folks, investors are able to get tax cuts or use money in order to invest, and then we're hoping that it's going to trickle down to everybody else. Let's not prioritize equity, let's prioritize efficiency. And in the regulatory space as well, we've had an obsession with efficiency, with what's known as Calder-Hicks or potential Pareto efficiency, where let's not worry about who's getting the benefits or who's paying the cost. Let's focus on maximizing output, maximizing the social surplus, and then worry about how the pie is divided up down the road. And I think, unfortunately, that approach has led, not just to exploding inequality. We see it not just on race or income or wealth, but also between urban coastal areas and rural heartland areas, between small business and big business, between young and old. So we've seen an explosion in inequality, but we've also, I think, more counterintuitively have seen a slowing of economic growth. The last few decades, growth has actually been slower than it was in the middle of the 20th century when tax rates were much higher, minimum wage was much higher, union strength was much higher. So I just would like to push back a little bit on this idea that equity is somehow at odds with a broad prosperity and a flourishing economy. So I think that's the larger equity question. Again, speaking not on moral terms or legal terms or political terms, but really narrowly on the economics. And on the regulatory approach, you know, as I mentioned, I think in regulations there has been often an obsession with efficiency, with maximizing net benefits, but not paying attention to who is paying the costs and who is getting the benefits, or at least not an explicit reference to that. It's actually been mentioned in all of the executive orders that govern the regulatory review process that policymakers should consider distribution, should consider equity for many years, going back to the 1990s. Republican and Democratic presidents have affirmed that, but agencies actually just haven't really been doing it. It's technically difficult, and it's also you know, goes against this obsession with Calder-Hicks efficiency. And so I think a lot of folks, you know, on the left were probably pushing this administration to just jettison cost-benefit analysis entirely. And to their credit, I think really the headline for what the administration has done on regulatory review is they've reaffirmed, you know, the Reagan approach from the 80s that basically sets up a centralized review process, tries to coordinate government. You know, I don't think maybe they had the words whole of government approach back when Reagan set up this review process, but I don't see anything nefarious about what he and other presidents have done in trying to coordinate executive branch action around regulatory review. And so, you know, Biden has revised the Circular A4, which, like I say, is this guidance document that helps agencies better understand how they should be doing cost-benefit analysis. Equity is definitely part, you know, I think it's, you know, maybe 5 to 6 pages on distributional impacts in a 90-something page document that is very technical about all the different ways that agencies should be thinking about how to do their work. You know, on the exact way that Biden has gone about trying to emphasize equity, I'm happy to get into the details at some point. But you know, the main thrust is that, going back to my earlier point, I think if you really want to maximize net benefits, you have to understand, you know, who exactly is gaining and who is paying the costs. Let's see, is there anything else? Oh, and on, I mean, the other, I think, important thing about the emphasis on equity in the Circular A4 is that it really brings to light, I think, probably decisions that were already being influenced by distributional analysis. So I don't think any of us are so naive to think that political actors within the executive branch were not thinking about who wins and who loses when they were issuing regulations. It's the essence of politics. But now, if the agencies follow some of the new guidelines, they will be you know, more transparent, and there'll be more accountability around exactly what agencies are considering when they're making these decisions, which I think is something we should all be able to agree on. So I'll pause there and look forward to questions and discussion, and yeah, appreciate the attention.
Thank you. And Anthony, did you want to talk a little bit more about the contrast between the mechanisms of regulation and the policies, and which matter more?
Yes, thank you very much, General Scrimetti, and to the group here. This is a great discussion. Yeah, I mean, I think that taking a cross-cutting approach to managing, administering the executive branch, to me, is not necessarily problematic. In fact, I think that there's a pretty good case to be made that we want a vigorous executive. You know, obviously, Article 2, Section 1 vests the executive power in the president, not in cabinet secretaries, not in career staff. It's in the president. The president should provide direction and guidance for the agencies that serve under the president's power and work under the president's power given to them. And the statutory program is obviously created by Congress, but managed by the president at the top. So I think that is, overall, we want to manage, we want the administration to be, we want the, I guess, having a cross-cutting approach to administration and management is not necessarily a problem. I think it is on the policy side, the extent to which we are sort of making law through the executive branch instead of setting out, having a particular approach to administering the executive branch. As Gail said, I think, first of all, I'm going to say that the whole of government is a bit of a misnomer, right? I mean, we have a very, sophisticated system of government where we are balancing federal government with state government, right? We have state governments obviously play a very important role, and then within the federal government we have executive, legislative, and judicial. So we really are indeed talking about whole of the executive branch, not whole of the government. And even within the executive branch, largely today, the independent agencies are off sort of doing their own thing and not reporting in directly to the president. So it's not even really whole of the executive branch if you would think of the independent agencies as being part of the executive branch and operating under that power. So it's a whole of a subset of the executive branch. But within the executive branch, we want president's direction, we want coordination and direction, I think. But it really should be at the margins. It shouldn't be lawmaking. And to a significant extent, this problem, I think, exists because we have had so many open-ended grants of rulemaking authority to the agencies. There's a lot of flexibility. And then after that, obviously, I think our deference doctrines in the court have allowed agencies a lot of run room to go and make law to a significant degree. And so within that framework, I think that hopefully what happens, I think, in Relentless and Loper Bright will help to address some of this in the near term. In the near term, the president cannot really make law. This is, but having the correct approach to administration, I think, is important. We had, of course, cross-cutting mechanisms for administering the executive branch, policymaking in the executive branch. We had Executive Order 13771 that set out a regulatory budget, Executive Order 13777 that created regulatory reform task forces, which were charged with carrying out the regulatory budget as well as direction from Presidents Clinton and Obama on previous executive orders. We set up task forces. There are also a lot of other kind of cross-cutting approaches to sort of, again, on the policy management and administration side. Some of them are in statute, some of them are in executive order. We have the Regulatory Flexibility Act, the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act, the Congressional Review Act. We had executive orders on guidance. So a lot of kind of cross-cutting management programs of the executive branch. And I think that's appropriate, that's what we want. I think we don't want the president, though, to sort of use that, that position to really be making the law. So, so then to just kind of talk briefly about how I think that, just to talk within the executive branch, the policy-making process, I mean, two key parts of how I think there has long been a whole of government approach, if you will. One is on the policy-making process. I mean, generally, you have an interagency group, folks from all the different agencies, from all the different White House components gathered together to discuss policy ideas and directions, and to figure out where, at the margins, in particular rulemakings, and they can drive those policy outcomes. So that has been around for a very long time. And then on the back end, you have similar interagency processes around specific rules that gather all the wisdom and interests of the executive branch to share perspective and figure out how to guide a particular rulemaking to an outcome that is rationally integrated across the government. So again, I think that there are these kind of I think of it more as cross-cutting rather than whole of government. coordination, integration, but it really is a focus on how you administer the programs, not necessarily on driving, again, kind of the legal sort of legal change. I think the more that it is about administration, I think the better. The more it is sort of quasi-lawmaking, I think is where it gets a little bit tougher. David just talked OMB Circular A4 that has been around for a very long time. I thought the old version was great. It was about having a consistent approach to economic analysis that cut across rulemakings and across the years and the decades. The new approach basically takes a lot of, in my view, it takes a lot of policy judgments that have always been appropriate to consider, and it puts it into the underlying analysis, which I find to be very troubling, because to me, the idea of the analysis is to have one kind of rail that runs throughout the decades that you can look and you can evaluate policy choices against that rail. And there were plenty of things that I don't like about it. There are things that David didn't like about it. But there, as he mentioned, there was always a part that was focused on distributional effects. So every administration could have looked at that, did look at that to various extents. But once you start to weight those considerations and you put them in the analysis, it kind of, I think it actually flows a little bit from in my view, a misunderstanding of the role of analysis. Analysis was never meant to determine the outcome of a rulemaking on its own. It was to provide a sort of a reference point. It was to provide an input into the policymaking process. And I think there's been a little bit of an idea that it controls the outcomes, and it really has not for a very long time. If it did, we would have, I think, a lot fewer rules and a lot less onerous regulatory state. But it has been an input into the decision-making process. So I think that anyway, what happened with OMB Circular A4 and with executive order that occasioned the rewrite of A4 recently. I mean, I think that there is a real effort to kind of drive policy outcomes that are more quasi, lawmaking that really focuses more on the lawmaking side, the quasi-lawmaking side of the agencies, and that's where I think it gets a lot tougher. Mm-hmm. But just administering in a cross-cutting way, the executive branch under the direction of the president, to me, that is not, in itself problematic.
Thank you, Anthony. So one thing that comes to mind is the difference between the more traditional procedural-oriented whole-of-government approach that you just talked about in terms of regulatory budget, in terms of the use of guidance documents, things that do apply across agencies that are relatively light touch. It's just telling people, hey, here are the mechanisms that you're going to focus on, here's how you're going to use them. And I think the embedded equity idea, to the extent that you're incorporating that into calculations of regulatory cost and just providing distributional information for the purpose of policymakers to evaluate the decisions in front of them, seems like a lighter touch than what we're seeing now, which is relatively aggressive policymaking, sometimes contravening what Congress has said, or at least going far beyond the interstitial regulatory approach, and seeing a robust policymaking in the executive branch. But one of the concerns I have is the agencies are not freestanding agencies to assert the president's will. Even if you accept that there's a unitary executive, the structure of the executive branch is established via legislation. Congress is creating these agencies where the president executes certain parts of the law through these agencies. Do we have to worry about competence being impacted because the agencies are suddenly having to focus on significant policy questions that maybe at best tangentially touch upon what they're supposed to be looking at? And do we have to worry about almost a commissar-oriented approach to government where, because you're talking about finite resources and a government that at best can sometimes get things right. And that's nonpartisan. I mean, being part of the government, I can confess that, we do our best and often either miss the mark or don't execute as well as we should, no matter how hard people are trying. So if you're trying to do a hard job already, and then you have to start looking at significant other pieces of law that are outside the scope of what you ordinarily worry about, is that going to give us worse government in the long run as executive branch leadership focuses on more whole-of-government approaches? Gail, do you have a professor?
Yeah. In a word, yeah, I think it will. But I think maybe it's like the things that are likely to be adopted with a whole of government approach these days are often things that are almost quasi-religious. And you can imagine, well, first of all, the equity case, but I can imagine, another whole of government approach being, climate change. What is the post office going to do about climate change? What is this department, that department, and the next department going to do about this? And it does. It's going to. It's like a wind-up toy. You've got the wind-up toy that's supposed to be like deliver the mail, deliver the mail, deliver the mail, and now suddenly they got to do an 180-degree turn and be involved in climate change or equity or something. And I think it's just part of the way the times are. That what is likely to be adopted with a whole of government approach is going to be those things that are highly controversial and that. Maybe, just maybe, a segment of society has become obsessed with an idea that's going to turn out not to be such a great idea. And I think we're seeing that already with the transgender issue, where Europe is already turning away from it. And we're still marching full speed ahead, in part because we embed it in the law, whereas other countries might not be quite so quick to make it a legal matter. As Tocqueville observed, we make everything a legal matter. And therefore, it's hard to get things back on track once there's been a problem.
And David, would you like to comment?
Well, I'm just going to point out, I think if I heard our keynote speaker earlier correctly, Mr. Ray, he was kind of professing a concern about the opposite, right? That these agencies are so specialized that they're going to miss the forest from the trees. They're going to be so focused on delivering the mail, they're not going to realize that, and this is one of the reasons I guess Congress is better suited to do this work, because they have to bargain over the big picture. So I guess I could see it being framed in the opposite way as well, which is that, to the extent that climate change is an existential threat, which maybe not everybody here agrees, but I think and to the extent that equity has been a long-standing challenge and that there has been racial discrimination in our country and that these are major priorities that the president ran on and won on. These weren't like things that he has been hiding the ball on. He has clear policy preferences on these areas, and so he's pursuing an agenda in that way. I don't think the fact that agencies are being asked to do more than just one thing is necessarily a bad thing. Harkening back to the earlier comments about, there's also a tunnel vision problem as well if you don't allow that holistic thinking. So,
I would just add that most of these executive orders conclude with a provision that says, to the extent permitted by law, and the extent permitted by law may change dramatically in the near term if some of our friends in this room are successful, as we think they may be, at the Supreme Court. And so some of the things that we put in an executive order that would say, here's how you should manage processes of the government. I think that the administration function of the president is totally appropriate, but the quasi-lawmaking stuff, when you're adding considerations that are outside of the normal consideration in a program designed by Congress, those may start to get beat back a little bit more.
Yeah, I couldn't agree. And to the earlier point, sure, this administration and this presidency campaigned on equity, But show me one instance of the president defining that term and saying, but by equity, what I mean is racial categorization of the following 5 races and then treating some Americans differently on the basis of race. So there is always this, if you're in the academic context or in the litigation context, you become accustomed to this slippery use of language. Equity is a high-sounding and vague phrase, right? And the example I illustrated, the United States Department of Agriculture, we start with saying equity, then you've got an equity action plan saying it's a priority, and then you get to the end of the road and Congress sets aside $25 billion for disaster relief for farmers affected by natural disaster, and it's just a form on file and a box you check. And that's not what anybody has campaigned on. I dare say that if anybody did, the American people would recoil in horror. And so, you do see these whole of government approaches being used to do things that I think the American people are just not aware of. And, if they want to generate awareness, the constitutionally hygienic thing to do is to present these questions to the American people through legislation.
Well, and I want to follow up, Braden, because you had touched on the non-delegation issues. But at the same time, I mean, the president does have discretion in how the law is executed once Congress legitimately delegates that authority or provides a legal basis for execution. Obviously, Congress can't delegate plenary lawmaking authority, but how much latitude does an administration have in adjusting the execution of the laws based on their priorities?
Well, I think at a minimum, it can't contravene the Constitution. And the guarantee of equality is pretty firmly embedded in our nation's history and our nation's tradition. Part of the whole of government approach, it isn't just, as I said earlier, the rejection of equality, but it is the tension with the separation of powers doctrine. And again, to address the rhetorical slippery language, when we talk about whole of government, the problematic part of it isn't that we're trying to make government more efficient or that we don't want the executive branch all rowing in the same direction. Of course we do. The problem is that there is now an open embrace of aggressive, muscular executive branch action, even when either Congress won't act, and we know that that's the reason why the executive branch is acting, or the Supreme Court has said you can't do this, and the executive branch turns around to try and find an exception to doing it anyway. And we see recent examples of that from everything ranging from immigration to student loans. And so that's the problem with the whole of government approach, not the efficiency in government operations.
And Professor Harriet, you talked a little bit about the difficulty in remedying whole of government run amok via judicial or congressional oversight. Braden just talked about that as well. Do you care to elaborate a little more? I know you had some time to talk about it, but you were a little truncated because of the time.
I mean, yeah, the problem is, look at the most recent decision of the Supreme Court, the most recent big decision on race issues, and that is Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard. You're dealing with institutions that are as small as, a public university, which is, it's kind of big, but it's not like the federal government. And even with that, the first thing that happens is that universities start announcing how they're working to get around this. Well, we're going to get the same thing with the federal government, only the federal government is bigger than Harvard University. And there are so many more ways in which you can get around, what the court has said. It's an old story. These Supreme Court decisions on race issues, whether we're talking about Brown versus the Board of Education or we're talking about the SFFA case, there are ways in which government officials try to get around them, and they're definitely going to do that here. I mean, right now the federal government is riddled with these race programs, they can read, the lawyers for each one of these departments and agencies, they can read the decision. In theory, SFFA deals with college admissions. But if you read the case, it's very clear the Supreme Court has now taken a much stronger line on race preferences. And this is going to apply not just to universities, it's going to apply, to just about everything you can think of. And yet, The world hasn't changed. You know, the federal government did not say, "Ooh, we're going to get rid of all these programs that we have now," and they're going to, each one is going to have to be rooted out individually. And when you're talking about grant programs, you know, like those administered by the National Science Foundation, every time a panel decides upon whether or not to give a grant to a particular you know, academic who wants to investigate something to do with chemistry or whatever it happens to be. You know, every time they're taking into consideration, well, is this group sufficiently racially diverse? How are you going to get to those individualized, you know, retail decisions that are being made? It's going to be hard. It means actually changing the culture of these agencies. Not just changing what the Supreme Court says, or not just changing what Congress says, not just changing what the regulations say, but, you know, getting to where a particular panel that is investigating, you know, whether or not to make grants to a particular kind of researcher, whether or not they are willing to say, look, we're not going to look at race.
And David, do you want to comment on the separation of powers concerns?
I have to go back to my Georgetown law days. I don't practice law, and but I will say that it doesn't seem to me that the moment that we're in and the interplay that's being described between the courts and the executive branch and Congress is particularly unique to this moment in time. I mean, there's been, you know, as Mr. Ray was talking about, the branches of government are set up to compete against each other, and that's one of the major checks on the system. So I guess, you know, to use the Gale imagery from before about the Neptune, the alien from Neptune coming down, I just don't see an alien from Neptune coming down and seeing, you know, the president's equity agenda as the threat to the rule of law in this country. It seems like there's much, much bigger, more serious threats to the rule of law in this country at the moment. And that, yes, courts change law, executives have to respond, Congress tries to assert itself. All of that seems to me a very natural way that our system works. And I don't think that, you know, the president's focus on equity, which again is really about removing barriers for, you know, so that all groups can and all people can fully participate in, you know, in the economy is what I'm most concerned about, but in the democracy, I think is another obvious goal. Yeah, I don't see that as a hugely nefarious or, you know, real threat to the Constitution that maybe some of my fellow panelists do.
Anthony, did you want to add anything?
Well, on that last point, I do kind of always find it interesting that some pick on David, but those who embrace sort of lawmaking through the executive branch or through the, you know, the agencies talk about democracy when actually, like, that I think I mean, obviously the president is elected by the people, but so the members of Congress are supposed to make law. The democratic lawmaking should happen in Congress. And making you know, quasi-law through the rulemaking process is like the least democratic way to do things. So I would say if you love democracy, like, push for Congress to make law and push all that lawmaking over there. I think that this is a great, you know, this, as David said, the moment we're in. I mean, I think the moment we're in is a great moment for Congress to just really vigorously embrace its role as the lawmaking body. I mean, I think this is sort of the core of the you know, issue that gives rise to you know, why we have some of these deference standards, is that we have such broad grants of discretion to the agencies, and the agencies are they're using the authority that they have as they see it to push policy. There are fewer barriers to pushing out policy in the executive branch. You don't have to have hundreds of members sign off. You don't have bicameralism and presentment. You have, you know, a lot like easier path to pushing your policy out, and that creates some real challenges. I don't think that's really how it's supposed to be. So we want to push that lawmaking back to Congress. Congress could go and narrow and cabin those grants of discretion, particularize instructions to the agencies instead of leaving open-ended grants out there. I think that's a great, you know, thing for them to run with now.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point. The whole of government approach, as I understand it, originated in parliamentary systems where it really was the whole of government, where the executive authority and the legislative authority are combined. And so it's entirely plausible for somebody to claim that they're speaking on behalf of the government as a whole. Here, because of our separation of power system, whole of government is to some extent overstating it. And speaking on behalf of the states, the concern is because Congress is not engaged in lawmaking to the extent that they should be for a variety of very frustrating and complicated and intractable reasons, you see more and more power accreting to the federal executive branch, and that doesn't just undermine the ability of the other branches to serve their appropriate roles in the overall policy making and policy enforcing agenda. It undermines the states, because the bigger the federal government, the more robust the policy pursuits of the federal agencies, the less room there is for state decision making, and the more preemption we see. So it's a real concern. We have time now to open it up for some questions. As is traditional at these events, I will say this is for questions. If you have a lengthy commentary, there are other opportunities for you to express those opinions, but we certainly welcome questions for the panelists. Yes, sir.
So my question arises from the two things I think that have characterized the theme of this discussion. One is that the whole of government approach has emerged as a way of dealing with gaps or things where Congress hasn't acted where the president would like to act, and two, where the president would like to avoid judicial review. My question is, doctrinally, what should the courts do to address this? Because we've seen things like major questions doctrine, which deal with an individual agency's power grab, but we haven't seen something where if it gets cut up into a bunch of different pieces, what one judge called regulatory smurfing, like the kind of way that you hide a large financial crime by dividing it up into little bits. How should courts approach that? It seems to me a problem that's very much unsolved by the current doctrine.
It's a great question. Anthony, do you
I was
want
going to say if Braden wanted to.
I thought that was for you guys, right? I'm not, what's the question?
But I think the question is, how do the courts deal with it when, there are significant problems with the court coming in and saying this policy as a whole is bad, so every agency should stop doing it. There are a lot of fights going on in which we're saying, hey, courts, your jurisdiction is limited to the parties in front of you. And I love the image of smurfing, which comes from people sending out lots of folks to buy small amounts of meth precursors. Interesting metaphor there.
You might have been a prosecutor one day.
Possibly. How do we deal with this? Is that part of the reason the courts can't appropriately respond? And is there some sort of jurisprudential doctrine that would help?
I wish it were easier to deal with guidances in court rather than having to just, an agency puts out something that purports to be an interpretation of a statute, but really what it is it's the law, and it's very difficult to challenge them in court, and I think it should be easier.
Yeah, probably like a lot of people who litigate for a living in my world, I think that the court's standing doctrines, I'd love to see some rethinking of that, but until that happens, I agree with Professor Harriet, it's going to make it very difficult to challenge even things like EOs until they actually matriculate into cases and controversies. And there is some real need for it. You've seen it on illustration today where there's back and forth on what the meaning of the term equity is. The EO uses the term equity, but it's only until you get to the actual practical application of it that you see that it involves overt race discrimination. And that's the part that's constitutionally and legally problematic.
That's not the most reassuring answer, but I think it definitely, the question highlights a serious structural problem here. Judge Vaden?
Yes, I have a question for Braden. Braden, you noted that the United States Department of Agriculture took the actions that you're currently suing them about after being subject to injunctions across the country for similarly race-based distinctions that the department drew. Of course, the difference being that in that case, the race-based distinctions were actually congressionally authorized. Here, in your case, they're not. The Small Business Administration similarly found itself under injunctions. Your question and the timeline of it, to me, raises questions about future accountability for the officials who have taken these actions. The current administration has set a lot of precedents that will be hard to erase, as the professor noted. One of those precedents involves very aggressively going after officials from the prior administration for civil and even criminal sanction for actions that they took in office. I'm curious, given how the standards go about qualified immunity, in particular how one loses qualified immunity if the law is clear, would you have any advice for the current Secretary of Agriculture and Undersecretary for Farm Programs and Conservation, as well as the civil servants who are administering this program, as to what might be in their future when, at some point, either in January or 4 years hence, the administration changes?
Right. Well, I'm not in the business of giving legal advice to people that I don't represent, but so take that for what it's worth. But I mean, I think the point that you raise is a totally valid one. Every court to look at the question socially disadvantaged in the racial categories has determined that they are constitutionally unlawful or likely to be declared to be constitutionally unlawful. And you have an instance where the Secretary of Agriculture then, withdraws from that category, but then proliferates it in other aspects throughout the code. I mean, is that not a situation where, to borrow from the 1983 analogy, you have an official on actual knowledge that what they're doing is unlawful, in which case in the 1983 context, that would give rise to potential individual liability suits. Judge Vaden posed the question, there are civil rights laws out there too that are going to contain a mens rea requirement. You can easily imagine that the actual knowledge that these programs are unlawfully discriminatory might generate some kind of, might make it plausible that there is a civil rights violation going on that's actionable by a future administration if they were so inclined. Ultimately what I would rather see, and this is sort of alluded to by Paul's comments, is I want to get back to a sense where we have a shared sense of constitutional values. At the time of the founding, there was a sense that the Constitution wasn't just going to be written law. It was going to be a value system that all of our elected officials and all of the Americans would openly embrace. And I don't think that we have that shared sense of constitutional commitment in our culture anymore, particularly from high-level officials who oftentimes just really feel like they have competing imperatives and they want to see if they can get away with it. And I think that's really unfortunate.
Could the Anti-Deficiency Act also potentially apply?
I'm not going to comment on the Anti-Deficiency Act, but yeah.
Yes, sir.
Hi. I had a question for all of the panelists, kind of bringing it to a lower level. But sometimes we're at a level of debating things at a level of abstraction. What is equity? Do we want this policy, that policy, or the Supreme Court opinions? In terms of what happens really at trial courts and sort of the enforcement mechanism, what do you see the barrier to things like SFFA or cases in other contexts really trickling down into real wins for plaintiffs and real shifts in policy? Because we just heard about whether government officials have criminal liability in the future or civil for violating civil rights or engaging in this discrimination, kind of putting the shoe on the other foot. What is the obstacle? Is it the circuit courts? Is it the trial courts? Is it some other doctrine the Supreme Court hasn't changed enough? Qualified immunity, standing doctrine? So what's really preventing these things from trickling down and changing society the way that society was changed by the left in the 1960s through the civil rights movement, both litigation, constitutional, and statutory changes?
Facts are standing in our way, and that is you have to prove facts in court. And if a university is discriminating in admissions, for example, they're not stupid. They're going to come up with a way to hide it. The Supreme Court had the discretion to accept the Thomas Jefferson High School case just a few months ago, where the board controlling admissions to Thomas Jefferson made it very explicit that they thought they had too many Asians, so they changed the rules. They didn't change the rules to say no Asians. They changed the rules in ways that made it so there would be fewer Asians and more of other races. And the Supreme Court didn't take the case, even though I thought it would have been a good one for them, because there was a Fourth Circuit decision that I think was clearly, making errors about what the law is. But if every time cases have to be litigated in front of a court, and it has to be proven that the motivation of the university or college or high school in deciding on admissions was to affect the racial composition of the students. That's going to get very difficult. And there aren't enough lawyers willing to work on something like this, and the facts are going to be hard to prove. And so it's going to be difficult. It's not going to be easy.
But if the races were flipped, for example, if it was Hispanics instead of Asians or blacks instead of Asians, do you still think there would be a factual problem for the plaintiffs to win?
Well, you wouldn't even need to worry about bringing lawsuits because governmental agencies would enthusiastically jump in before it even got to that point in time.
That's what happened with the laws as they developed after Brown versus the Board of Education. The courts were getting nowhere in the 50s on Brown. They were not able to bring individual school districts into compliance with the Brown case. It was not until the federal government with Title VI had the ability then to say, look, we're going to cut your federal funding off if you don't get in line, that you started getting a lot more compliance because it was much easier to deal with that way. And so it takes more than the judicial branch. It took the executive branch to make that work. And even just to take an example, Lewis Powell, he becomes the hero of the civil rights group after the Bakke case. But when he was on the board of the Richmond School Board, it wasn't so helpful on implementing Brown. Was not exactly a civil rights hero at that point. And it takes a lot. I mean, it took a lot to make Brown work. It'll take a lot to make the Harvard case work.
Thank you.
Thank you, and I apologize. We're over time. Please join me in thanking the panelists. Thank you for that wonderful commentary.
Yes, thank you very much. We will take a 8-minute break. We will have the criminal law panel, breakout panel in this room. And if you're going to the religious liberty discussion, that'll be down the hall in Palm Court. Thank you all very much.